Chapter 7. Disturbing Arrivals. Leah could not control the skidding of her heart, nor the sudden cramp in her chest that made each breath a painful effort. "Calm down," she berated herself, but it did not help. Zared was only moments away, and it had been so long since she'd seen him. Drago did not say a word as he led her down the corridors and stairwells of Sigholt. Leah leaned on him without embarrassment. Without him, she thought, she could not walk, and Drago made no complaint. It was late afternoon, and the keep threw a deep shadow over the courtyard. Leah stumbled slightly as she and Drago walked outside, and he tightened his arm and drew her a little closer. "Hope," she thought she heard him say, but when she glanced at his face it was expressionless, his eyes elsewhere, and so she thought she might have imagined it. There were several ranks of soldiers lined up in the courtyard, their hands ready on the hilts of their swords to provide a welcoming salute. Salem, dressed all in black, walked forward to greet her. Askham was 2 or 3 steps behind. Leah saw Salem exchange a hard glance with Drago, and she felt Drago stiffen at her side, but she had no time for further observation of the brothers' enmity. "Zared?" she asked Salem, and was stunned to hear her voice come out cool, calm even. "A minute away," Salem said, "no more." And indeed, at that moment Leah heard the bridge call out to Zared, welcoming him. The bridge did not challenge him, for Zared had been born within Sigholt's walls, and she knew him well. Almost before the bridge had finished her greeting, there came the clatter of many hooves on the bridge, and Leah had a moment of panic. Gods, what was she wearing? A pale blue linen gown that could be called serviceable, nothing more. And her hair! Leah's free hand patted at her head, remembering with horror that this morning she'd left her hair in nothing but a single thick braid down her back. "Leah?" Zenith's soft voice said behind her. "You look lovely, do not fret." I should be greeting Zared in the audience chamber of our palace in Carlon, Leah thought, resplendent in the satins and jewels, not here in this dairymaid's gown. And she had no more time for thought, for at that moment Zared rode into the courtyard. She was the first thing he saw. Absolutely stunned, Zared pulled his horse to such a sudden skittery halt that Hermie and Theod, who rode directly behind him, had to rein their own mounts sharply to one side to avoid him. "Leah?" he whispered. At that precise moment the ranked soldiers presented their swords and standards, and a trio of trumpets high in Sigholt's walls blew out a clarion of welcome. In the sudden presentation of arms, and the flags and banners fluttering about, Zared lost sight of Leah. Frustrated, he leapt from his horse, ducked under its neck, and came face to face with an impassive star-sun Salem. "Prince Zared, I welcome you to Sigholt. May its doors always swing wide to greet you, and its bridge always sing you a greeting." "Damn these polite receptions," Zared cursed. He tried to see past Salem, but he only saw Askham farther back in the gloom, and the first of the ranks of stony-faced soldiers. "I thank you, Star-Sun," he replied evenly. "I, as must my other companions among the 5, find myself somewhat surprised to be so suddenly called to council." "You know why you are here," Salem said, his voice toneless, and Zared wondered how long Askham had been in Sigholt, and what he'd managed to whisper into Salem's ear. While not as close as their fathers had been, Salem and Askham were nevertheless friends. "This disunity between you and Askham must finally be put to rest." Askham had whispered nothing complimentary, Zared thought. "Then I welcome the summons, Star-Sun. I wish for nothing more than peace and harmony within Ten Sendor." Salem's eyes had slipped behind Zared. "Hermie? Theod? Why do you travel with Zared?" "We met the Prince of the North coming through the lower Urquhart Hills," Hermie said easily, "and chose to ride the final leagues with him. Theod and myself thought to have our voices heard at this council, as the weighty matter before it affects all those living in the West, as in the North." Far back in the column of Zared's escort, Goldman and Hevrin pulled their hoods a little closer over their faces. No doubt Salem's enchanted eyesight could spot them if he chose, but they did not want Askham to see them. Their business was best conducted without their prince knowing why they were at Sigholt. "Who gave you permission to attend this council?" Askham stepped forward to Salem's shoulder. "Theod, you should be at home, attending your seasonal country courts. Hermy, you should know better than to present your uninvited self at Sigholt." Theod was lost for words, but Hermy replied smoothly, "I did not realize our freedom of movement, our choice of movement, was also subject to your whim, Sir Prince." "Enough," Salem snapped. Truly Theod and Hermy should have known better than to ride in with Zered as if he was their prince, not Askham. But Hermy had also made a telling point, and Salem did not regret the chance to hear from someone other than Askham on how the West was responding to the taxes. "You may stay, Sir Duke and Sir Earl," he said, his tone more even now. "I shall organize the afternoon to speak with you, but I also reserve the right to invite you or bar you from council as I please." He turned slightly and called to his steward, "Runton, prepare chambers suitable for the Duke and Earl. Zered, perhaps you might like to dine with me tonight." Zered ignored his invitation. "Salem," he said softly, "what is Leah doing here?" Salem stared at him a moment, then waved Leah forward. She hesitated, and the man at her side, Zered noticed with some surprise who it was, spoke softly in her ear. Leah gave the smallest of nods, then walked forward calmly to stand at Salem's side. "Zered," she said simply, her eyes fixed on his. Zered opened his mouth, found he could say nothing, and so stepped forward, took her hand, and kissed her palm. "I think we will resolve many things in this council," Salem said softly, "not only the issue of taxes." The evening meal, held with due pomp in the great hall of Sigholt, was the longest Zered had ever endured in his life. All of the heads of the 5 were there, as were their captains, their lieutenants, Salem's brother and sisters, Darewing, Fullheart, and the other crest leaders of the strike force, the mayor and the entire council of Lakesview, and their wives, as well as Wingridge Curlclaw, Spikefeather Truesong, and 15 assorted enchanters. Leah was seated not only across the broad banquet table, but 7 places down. Zered had not the chance to speak one word to her, let alone touch her, hold her. If the decision on their marriage was to be discussed, and then determined in council, then Zered knew what that decision would be. Damn Salem, and every other member of the council, to everlasting crippling arthritis for what they are going to do to him and Leah. Did they not bed as they chose? Had not every one of them picked their own mate? Save Salem, of course, who yet lingered unmarried. Zered went through the meal in a state resembling an angry fugue, replying only in monosyllables when he was addressed, pushing his meat about his plate until it went cold and congealed in its gravy, then tapping his fingers irritably against the linen-cloth table until Salem finally rose and departed. As the rest of the company scraped back their chairs and got to their feet, Zered managed to catch Leah's eye, but no more. Askham placed a tight hand about her elbow and whisked her away before Zered could slip about the table to speak to her. He stood, fuming with silent rage, as Hermy paused behind him. "Think how marriage to her would cement your claim to the throne, my prince," he whispered. "Askham will never sire an heir. She would bring a car to your marriage bed." Zered turned to stare at him, a muscle working in his cheek. "I want her as my wife because I love her," he finally seethed, "not for her inheritance." He pushed past the Earl of Avonsdale and strode away, but all he could think about on the long walk back to his chambers was whether or not, on that night atop Sigholt 5 years ago, his unspeaking mind had only seen Leah standing before him, or the rich acres of the West as well. Zenith was preparing for sleep when the gentle knock came at her door. Surprised, not knowing who could wish to speak to her this late, she slipped a wrap over her shoulders and opened the door. Zered stood there, his face lined and tired, his eyes dark with unreadable emotion. "Zenith, you and I have always understood each other. Please, bring Leah to me." Zenith stared at him, her mind in turmoil. By the gods, how she felt for both of them. Surely they deserved at least a private word. But if left in private, how far might that word go? Their love was fraught with so much political tension, it carried such enormous consequences, that to even let them see each other— Should she tell him that Salem would not let the marriage take place, that there was no hope? No, there was no need. She could see by the pain in Zared's eyes that he already understood. "Zenith," he said, reaching out and placing a hand on her arm, "do this for me, and do it for Leah." Zenith hesitated only a heartbeat longer, then she gave a curt nod. "Come with me." The corridors were darkened, only a few subdued torches lit to cast pitiful pools of light in isolated corners. Shadows flickered and lifted, seeming to envelop them in waves and then retreat, as if they had moved too far from the total darkness for their own comfort. Zenith led Zared to a room on the floor above his, at the end of the corridor. He stopped, surprised. That was my mother's chamber. And so here came Magariz to Rivka, before they confessed their love to the world. Now, Zared, listen to me. I will wait outside, keeping watch, but not only for those who might tread this way. I can also sense you and what you do. Do you understand? Zared nodded, his expression bitter. If you try to bed with her, Zenith continued, her tone now as hard as Zared's eyes, I will know, and I will stop you. You may speak with her, you may hold her, but you will not have the chance to win the West via the trickery of an illegitimate child. Salem has an utterly loyal sister in you, Zared hissed, furious that Zenith would intrude upon them with her power. I am utterly loyal to Ten Sendor, Zenith said quietly, holding Zared's stare. Treat Leah with the respect that I have for the peace of our land. Let me in, damn you, and Zenith opened the door. The chamber was even darker than the corridor, for Leah had apparently shuttered her windows tightly closed. Zared stood, trying to get his bearings, wondering if Leah had heard his whispered conversation with Zenith. Apparently not, for the room was quiet, save for the soft sound of gentle breathing, and Zared moved carefully toward the source. His hip banged into the corner of a table, and Zared halted, his eyes stinging with the pain, his ears straining to hear if Leah had woken. No, she still breathed deep in sleep across the room, and Zared resumed his movement, now with a slight limp. He'd never wished enchanter powers for himself until this moment. By all the stars above, he wished he could see where he was going, but even as he thought that, a pale bed cover resolved itself from the darkness, and under it, Zared could see the still form of Leah. He moved closer. How could he best wake her without starting her into a loud cry? It would hardly do his cause good to have Salem, or Askham, gods forbid, burst in on them. But even as he hesitatingly reached down a hand, Leah sighed, turned her head, and opened her eyes. "Am I dreaming?" she whispered. "Or do you truly stand before me, Zared?" "Oh, gods, Leah," he cried softly, brokenly. He sat down on the bed and gathered her into his arms. Outside, Zenith tensed, but she gradually relaxed, tears coming to her eyes. What would it be like to love like this, to be loved this deeply? She withdrew her presence a little from the chamber to give them more privacy, although she still maintained watch. They could spend the hours before dawn together, but then she would interrupt and take Zared from Leah. The tears trickled down her cheeks. This was likely to be the only time they would ever have together. Then, without warning, a sense of doom so profound it left her gasping washed over her. Zenith groaned and bent almost double, clutching at the wall for support. What was wrong? What had disturbed her this deeply? Zared and Leah? No, they were close, but not too close. It was something else. Something so fundamentally wrong that even the star dance seemed to waver before it beat on as strong as ever. The sensation of imminent doom faded almost as soon as it had washed through her. But it left Zenith with such a feeling of fright that she had spent the rest of the night crouched outside Leah's door, wrapped in enchantment so thick that a spear would have bounced off an arm's distance away before it could have touched her. Zared, Leah, and Zenith were not the only wakeful ones that night. Salem also paced the corridors, returning to his own chambers from whatever nocturnal mission he'd set himself to. He also felt the sudden alteration in the star dance, But Salem was of infinitely more power than Zenith, and he knew that it had been caused by the sudden intrusion of a powerful enchanter somewhere in Tensendor. There was someone different about. Who? Who? Salem stood in the center of his chamber, seeking, probing through Tensendor with his power, feeling out whoever it was who had suddenly disturbed the star dance. He twitched. An expression of utter horror came over his face. "Wolfstar," he whispered, and then tipped back his head and screamed, "Wolfstar!" And then he vanished.